sparked attention to some major international headlines, also some major comments by President Trump about the ceasefire that is now in jeopardy between Israel and Gaza, and of course talking about the hostages as he does not necessarily have the patience for it right now. Is this a post from Jackie Heinrich talking about some comments he made in the Oval Office saying if all the Gaza hostages aren't returned by Saturday at noon, I would say cancel the ceasefire. He goes on to say more about this because it's so very interesting to talk about, saying I would say cancel it, all bets are off, let hell break out. All right, let's bring into the conversation for more on this FDD's senior research analyst, Joe Truzman. Joe, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. What do you make of these comments, and how hard of a deadline do you feel that is for this weekend?
Right. So I'm not surprised about President Trump's comments. Honestly, I was expecting something. All right, maybe not something as quickly as we got it today, but nevertheless, President Trump, he made his thoughts known, and he let Hamas know. He let Hamas's backers know what he thinks, and we know that he wants the hostages, all of them, to be released by Saturday at noon. And now he did leave a little bit of an opening there where Israel can change things a little bit. So, which is good. But nevertheless, we know what Trump thinks now, which is important. So now we have to see how Hamas reacts. How does Iran react? How does Qatar react? These are Hamas's backers. So I think the next days are going to be quite interesting. But is the ceasefire dead? I wouldn't say so just yet, but we can talk more about that afterwards. But at least for now, Trump's comments were quite interesting, expected. But now we just have to see what the other side says.
Yeah, that is a very good point, putting that deadline on it. And it also says Israel can certainly veto that if that's the case. I want to ask you, because it was last week, it was just last week, it was the first foreign leader he welcomed to the White House in Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Is there any indication that he told that leader that this potentially could be on his mind?
I'm not certain, but I would say that, I think something that's really important to highlight here, especially about today's events, especially about what Hamas's ultimatum here about the postponement of the hostage release, is that Hamas leaders were in Tehran this weekend, over the weekend. Also, the IDF withdrew from what's called the Netzarim axis, which is essentially this road that splits northern Gaza and southern Gaza. The IDF withdrew from this axis, from this road on Sunday, and now today we hear about Hamas's, about Hamas's statement about the hostages. So I think all of this, to be quite honest with you, I suspect there's a strategy here at play. All right. Not only that, but I suspect that Iran is trying to exert its influence here, not only against the president, but U.S. policy in the region and U.S. policy in Gaza. So I think that's really important to highlight.
And what do you mean by that? Can you explain that a little bit more about there might be strategy? What strategy is there?
Right, exactly. So as most of us noticed, we watched what happened on Saturday, this hostage release. Most of these, all of the hostages that were released that day, they looked malnourished. They looked like they had been through hell, essentially. And the public outcry that came from that, not only from Israel, but from the international community, we started hearing a lot about get the hostages out now, all right? Let's get all of them out. We don't need to wait. Israel does not need to wait anymore. So there was a lot of talk about that. And like you, like me, like everybody else, Hamas, they read the newspaper. They watch what's going on in the news. They take the Israeli public's temperature. They want to see how the Israelis react. So what I suspect here is that Hamas, they're trying to leverage this outrage. All right. They want to get as much as they can out of this hostage situation, out of this hostage deal. So what they can do here is, since they know that there's pressure on the Israeli government to get all of the hostages out because they are malnourished, because they are weak, because they may perish, what they can do is add more pressure to the Israeli government. But how do they do that? By declaring this postponement of a ceasefire, all right? So when they are rather the hostage negotiations or the hostage transfer, by doing that, also what happens is that they can pressure the government to get more out of them, out of the Israeli government. Hamas can do that just because they understand that Netanyahu is under this pressure from the Israeli public, and of course the families of the hostages. So I think that's very important here. And that's only just one possibility here that Hamas may be doing, but it just doesn't seem. It seems a little off that they're doing this right now, that they're postponing this, that they're creating problems. Of course, they've said it's due to certain issues that Israel's not implementing. But let's be honest here. I think they're just making up excuses. I think there's a strategy at play here, and Hamas wants to extract more concessions out of the Israeli government by withholding these hostages a little longer, because they know that the Netanyahu government is under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, that is so very interesting to note. And I think we were speaking to you or your colleague, Jonathan Shanzer, at the FDD when this ceasefire first went into place, talking about once they got the hostages back, they spoke to them, they saw how they were treated. That could change the complexion of the ceasefire. And you're seeing it in real time happen right now there. So that's very interesting. Let's get into some more comments made by President Trump about another component to this. Of course, he was talking about the fact that Gaza and Palestinians may be moved out of that region to be rebuilt. Of course, last week he floated his plan for the U.S. to take control of Gaza, turn it into the, quote, Riviera of the Middle East. And he says Palestinians now wouldn't have the right to return to Gaza. In your eyes, what would that look like? Is that even a real possibility?
Right. Again, I think it's... I would describe it as a surprising statement. However, I think what we've been hearing a lot about in recent weeks, especially in the last week or so, is this type of what's been coined a lot as out-of-the-box thinking. But nevertheless, I think what President Trump is trying to do, he's coming up with these scenarios, he's strategizing these scenarios to compel actors in the region, Egypt, Jordan, for example, to take on a greater role, all right, to support the Palestinians. I think they've done some through the war, these countries, right, with aid, but it hasn't been enough. And I think this is what President Trump is trying to do, trying to compel these countries to do something more. So he's coming up with these plans, he's making public statements about them. Can it happen? I think it'd be very difficult to move more than 1 million Palestinians out of Gaza. And I can tell you right now, there's about a dozen Palestinian factions, armed factions in the Gaza Strip that will do anything they can and everything they can to make sure that does not happen. So there's a lot of obstacles ahead if this plan is implemented. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. In some strong words, working very quickly, working in haste there, President Trump, as he does to compel, like you said, other nations to get maybe more involved. I do want to ask you, because also in those comments last week, President Trump did not rule out U.S. Deployment, people on the ground there. How would that complicate the region, just the optics of having boots on the ground for the U.S., but also, like you mentioned, with those other factions? Is that something that would complicate things very much so?
Yeah, I mean, it would make things more difficult. I think it would, again, as I mentioned earlier, it would compel armed groups, not only just Hamas, but there are groups that are aligned with Al-Qaeda, for example, in the Gaza Strip. There's groups that are aligned with the Islamic State, and they would target American troops if they were in Gaza. Absolutely, and some of these groups, as I mentioned, either the ones that are aligned with Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, they don't, they're not aligned with Hamas. They do what they want, all right? So even if Hamas says don't target American troops, they're not going to listen. So nevertheless, yes, it would complicate things. And what I would be concerned about too is not only just is what's happening, the actors in Gaza, but outside actors, all right? In Egypt, in Jordan, Iraq, in Lebanon, they're going to try to take advantage of this or leverage this to attack U.S. troops, to attack Israel. So again, yes, it does complicate things. U.S. boots on the ground in Gaza would make things difficult for sure. So again, right now, I'm not going to say that it's going to happen. All right. I think there's a lot of communicating that needs to be done between this administration and actors in the region, and of course between Israel and the United States. So we have a lot. There's still a lot to go. There's still a lot ahead of us. All right. So we'll see what happens again. But yes, it will complicate things greatly if American troops are on the ground in Gaza.
Yeah, a lot of different scenarios that we're running through. We don't know how many of these will eventually be realities. My last question before I let you go, because we've covered quite a bit, but they do have the King of Jordan in Washington, D.C. to meet with President Trump. What do we envision this meeting looking like, given the circumstances of the region? What do we expect to hear from them?
Right. Well, there's quite a few complications there, or complicating factors there. Right now, Jordan, they've had some issues for the last few years. I think Iran, for example, is trying to exert its influence in Jordan. And what I mean by that is activating proxies that may be within the kingdom, also on its borders, to essentially foment violence in the kingdom. Also, Jordan relies heavily on American aid. Also, of course, it has a peace treaty with the Israelis. So I think it's in Jordan's interest to keep a stable relationship, not only with the United States, but with Israel. So I think that those are some discussions that are going to come up. Also, I think, which is very important as well, is that Ahlam Tamimi, who was one of the participants who participated in the Sbarro suicide bombing, is actually a resident there in Jordan. And the United States should try to extradite her. I know the families of the victims of the Sbarro bombing have been trying to get Tamimi extradited to the United States because she drove one of the suicide bombers to his target, and Americans died there. So I think that's another subject that's going to come up. So again, a lot to talk about, and of course, like we spoke about before, the Palestinian issue. Will the Jordanians take in Palestinians? They've said they wouldn't. But it's a different thing when it comes to, conversations behind closed doors. So we'll see.
Yeah, a lot to get to, a lot that we talked about just in a short amount of time, Tro. Thank you so much for your perspective, for your insight. We appreciate your time, and potentially in just a week's time, it could all change again. So the deadline is this weekend at noon. Trump says about returning the hostages. We'll see what happens there. Thanks again for your time here on Live Now.